Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar on getting the most out of active classroom teaching about elections and voting. So we are all glad to have you here this afternoon. My name is Jessica Hayes. I am an active classroom certified trainer, and I am your host. Our presenter this afternoon is Michael Hutchinson. Michael recently retired after 42 years as a social studies teacher and department chair at Lincoln High School in Vincennes, Indiana. He was also an adjunct faculty member at Vincennes University. He has written several titles for social studies school service, including Conquering Close Reading and Big Ideas in U.S. History, as well as several U.S. history backwards planning units. He is also a certified active classroom trainer. He has also written curriculum for PBS regarding several Ken Burns films, including The Civil War, Prohibition, The Roosevelts and Intimate History, the Vietnam War, and country music, among others. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Jessica. Hope everybody can hear me okay. As Jessica said, please feel free to let her know via chat if you have any questions. We'll also have a little bit of time this afternoon after the session is over if you have questions that you'd like to ask me. So as Jessica mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about the upcoming election and how you can use Active Classroom to help you in your classroom curriculum as far as teaching about elections and voting. As Jessica mentioned, this is again just a little bit of bio about me. You can see a picture of me from about 20 years ago. I guarantee you I do not look like that now. And as Jessica mentioned, I just retired last spring after 42 years in the classroom, and boy did I pick a great time to retire, because we we had an awfully interesting spring in Indiana, just like I'm sure wherever you are you did too. So let's begin this evening with just a real quick mini discussion about challenges we face in teaching about elections and voting. So if you have specific things that you'd like to maybe mention about things that you see as challenging for this year, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Jessica can read them to me. I think probably the biggest issue, at least what I see, is, probably a lot of us are going to feel like we're going to be walking on eggshells as far as, what our own political beliefs are, or how do we teach this election compared to what our community feels about politics, and especially, like I said, the 2020 election. I can't speak for where you are, but I'm located pretty much in Trump USA. Indiana is a hotbed for Republicans. It has been for years. So, you have to be kind of careful about that. So if anybody has any particular issues or questions, that's my mother on the phone. But anyway, if you have anything you'd like to share on that, or Jessica, if you have anything you'd like to relate that they've mentioned to you.
Yes, Loretta actually says that parents are very sensitive and they listen to everything on Zoom, and her community is very divided.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. And, it seems like every day there's something new that divides us more. If we'd had this session last week, probably the big thing would have been the debate tonight, a week ago tonight, excuse me. And then certainly the president being diagnosed with COVID was an entirely different issue as well. So it's definitely an interesting election year, and I don't think it's going to be any less interesting as we get closer and closer to November 3rd. So let's talk a little bit about some specific things that we want to consider as we begin to look at active classroom or curriculum that we want to use as far as teaching about the election. And the three things that I thought were most important, number one, is we have to meet standards. So again, Indiana has specific standards dealing with, teaching elections and politics. My main area was U.S. history, but I'm also U.S. government, so I was aware of that. We also need to be able to meet whatever student ability levels are. In other words, like I taught everything from dual credit government to what I like to call meat and taters government. So in other words, I had kids that were taking government for college credit. I also had kids that were taking government simply to get a credit so that they could graduate from high school. So their ability levels were, to say the least, all over the chart, I guess. And of course, there's a move or a trend towards DOK, depth of knowledge, which I'll mention a little bit as we get farther into some of the things that we'll talk about as far as different activities and different curriculum that Active Classroom has that we can use. The next slide that I'll mention is, I'll just do this very quickly. I'm assuming that most of you have used Active Classroom before and you're fairly familiar with how Active Classroom works, how to search for different activities and that sort of thing. But if you are a new user for Active Classroom, there are several tutorials, help files that you can find simply by going to www.activeclassroom.com and then /help. So I wasn't sure what kind of level you would, comfort level you would have. I used Active Classroom for about 15 years, and it was, an easy experience for me to learn how to define activities and all that, but just in case you feel like you needed to have a little bit of background in that. So let's talk a little bit about two specific areas or two specific sets of activities that we can use as far as teaching about the elections. And the first one I'm going to talk about, current events. And as you can tell by looking at the slide, there is a slew of those different activities there. There's not much as far as on this slide at least about teaching the election. I'm going to focus on 2 or 3 different activities. One of them is going to be about the political primary system, and the other one will be about whether or not the voting age should be lowered. And then I'll also talk about a new one that's been put on the site, which deals with the United States Postal Service, which it seems like ages ago, but that was the big issue and the big concern and so forth from back about, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and now no one talks about that anymore. So I enjoyed using these as a classroom teacher. These activities are balanced. They help students develop critical thinking skills, develop their own viewpoints about issues. They're adaptable for high school learners and also for middle school. I taught high school. I did not ever teach middle school, but I could easily foresee that. So if any of you are middle school instructors, you'll see pretty quickly that these are easily used for your students, just like they would be for my juniors and seniors. So the first activity we'll talk about in this set, is one that's called Presidential Primaries. How are the candidates chosen? So when you select this activity, this is the first slide that comes up. And unfortunately, I couldn't get the entire slide to show on the screen. So this is just a screenshot of that. So the first arrow I'm going to show you, what the students will see is they'll see a splash screen that'll give them just a real quick overview about a description about what the activities are. And also it's kind of a neat graphic on there, so it kind of draws their interest. The second arrow that I want to show you is this one right here. This ribbon menu shows various menu items that you can access or the student can access. So for example, a little bit of an essay about caucuses and primaries, how the playoff runs, so to speak. Then there's an activity about candidate profiles, and then tracking the primaries is the third activity. One thing I do want to point out to everyone today, up at the top, there is a link to a PDF teacher's guide. Do not forget to look at the teacher's guide. And the reason why I say that is because there is a bunch of great information there that can help you as far as everything from answer keys to extension activities, all kinds of things that would be helpful to you as far as teaching this lesson. So I can show you a page from that a little bit later, from one of these a little bit later on. Again, if you have any specific comments or things that you would like to bring up at this point, please feel free to do that in the chat. Jessica can monitor that, and then if by chance, we can answer that now or at the end of the session, we'll be happy to do so. So moving on to the next slide, let's look at some activity questions that you'll see when you open up this lesson. At the top, you'll notice there's a little bit of the essay that goes with it, and then down below, there's, in this instance, there's about 4 questions that are visible, and you'll notice that they are DOK levels attached to each one. So like, for example, DOK1 is basic recall. A DOK2 would be application of skills and knowledge, that sort of thing. Then DOK3 is strategic thinking. How do you, take this and apply it to a real world situation or whatever. Now, I'm probably telling you something you already know, but on the teacher view, which is what I have, not only do you see the questions, but you see suggested answers. So, for example, in this question here, it says, how are primaries and caucuses like playoff games in sports? So below that, it gives you the answer. The students obviously do not see that answer. So what they would see is a little box where they could type their answer in if they were going to submit that to you, as far as to be evaluated on it. And again, as I said here, there are 2 DOK, or 2 questions. There's one DOK1 and there's one DOK3. So the next slide that we'll look at will describe the actual activity. And what it wants you to do in this instance, or it wants the students to do, is to research a particular candidate. Obviously, we are way past the primary season. So can you imagine what this would have been like in, say, February of 2020, when you had about 20 different Democratic candidates that were running for president? Everybody from Pete Buttigieg to, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the list goes on and on and on. So what they would do in this activity is they would look for, obviously, information such as the political party that the candidate belongs to, what is their, or what was their position on the issues. And then again, like before, a DOK3 question concludes the activity. In this instance, what the students do is they explain in a short essay, would you support this candidate? Yes or no won't cut it. They have to come up with a short essay that says, yes, I would support this candidate because I agree with his position on global warming, or I agree with her position about how to best handle the coronavirus, or, whatever the issue is. And so, again, it teaches kids to think critically a little bit about their own political views and what they see as, whether this candidate or that candidate would match up with that particular viewpoint. Another thing that you'll see when you notice with an active classroom activity such as this, and this is what you may see also in the teacher's guide, is a graphic organizer that students can fill out in order to follow along and complete the activity. So as you can tell in the first part of this, again, the whole thing is on this particular slide, but students are going to look at the directions, and then what they'll do is they'll complete, sorry, I went too fast on that, but they would complete a caucus primary calendar where they would say, okay, the Indiana primary was, and this year it was in June, and from there they would determine who the candidates were, what their issues were. Well, unfortunately for us in Indiana, by June, the primary season was pretty much over. We knew at that point that Joe Biden was going to be the Democratic nominee. And of course, we knew that Donald Trump was going to be the Republican nominee. And if I could go back to that organizer at the bottom of it, which you can't see on the slide, there's a really good DOK3 question. Choose one candidate and analyze why the candidate did well or did not do well in one state. Did the candidate's message resonate with the voters of the state? Why or why not? So again, students have to use their critical thinking skills. The next activity I wanted to show with you this evening is one about the voting age. How old is old enough? And in my case, this was kind of unique because I did use this in a distance learning situation, which probably some of you could relate to very well. We closed down for the school year on March 13. That was our last day with students. The next week was our spring break. We were told at that point we were going to stay closed for 2 more weeks. The governor of Indiana gave 20 days as far as, grace as far as missing days. Probably like you all are, we are a 180-day school year. So I expected we would go back to school around the first week in April. Well, then they postponed that until May, and then they postponed it until, well, we just didn't go back. So my last day in the classroom was March 13th. What we had to do is we had to provide remote instruction for students for nearly 3 months, which was no problem for me because I had active classroom. So that made it very simple. So all I had to do is go into whatever I was doing at that particular point in time. Last year I was teaching a current events class. I had never done it before, and it was a little bit more difficult than I thought it would be. So one of the things that I was able to do quite a bit was go to the current events activities in active classroom, and this is one of them that I used on a distance learning kind of a setup. So the features are very similar to the other activity I showed you. There's a teacher's guide, as you can tell by the ribbon. There's also, in this instance, there is a video analysis question, and then there's also a writing activity. So again, I can't stress enough, be sure to look at the teacher's guide. There's a lot of helpful information there that will make your job a lot easier if you wanted to do things, like I said, extension activities, or just get some insight about how to do the particulars as far as the activities that are listed here. So let's take a minute and look at the video analysis activity. So if you were actually looking at this in active classroom, this is pretty much what you would see. Again, I had to chop some of it because it wouldn't fit on the slide. But again, on the left side, you can see the ribbon menu. At the top, there is a link for the graphic organizer for this particular activity, and I will show you part of that in the next slide. Then this is the actual video. What this is, it's a YouTube link, so you probably knew already that you could embed YouTube videos in PowerPoint or in a web page, and this is what's been done here. So if the student, or excuse me, if the teacher decides, if you're one-to-one, for example, you could have each individual student look at this on their own device, whether they have a Chromebook or they have an iPad or they have a laptop or whatever, or in my case, the only way they could access instruction was online. We are one-to-one. Every student in my school has a Chromebook. So they should be able to see this video, and they should be able to fill the graphic organizer in based on what they see in the video. The video runs approximately 6 minutes, so even if I was using this in a normal classroom setting, what I could do is I could allow them the opportunity to watch the video multiple times if they felt that they needed to see it more than one time. So what we could do after that is after they watch the video, just like many other activities, at the bottom of the screen you can see there are reflection questions. Again, as I've mentioned before, the students see the questions, they do not see the suggested answers. And as you can tell, the answer key is in green, but it also gives you, the DOK level. Is this a DOK 1? Is this a DOK 2? In this instance, the questions that I'm showing you are both DOK 3. Okay, let's take a minute. We'll look next at the graphic organizer for this activity. And as you can tell, I couldn't do the entire thing, but I can show you part of it. So in this instance, the link for the video is here, is up here on the top. I don't know if you can see that very well or not. You might elect to have the students complete this either individually, or they could do it in pairs. I obviously did not have the ability to do it in a classroom setting, excuse me. So I don't know if I would have done it with students working in groups. We had, the best way I can explain it is a pretty finicky IT department that would not give us much leeway as far as doing much with audio files or video files. For example, a lot of the video for Active Classroom would not play. For some reason, the player that Active Classroom used did not play on student Chromebooks. However, it played on my teacher workstation. So what I did was I just threw it on the screen on my projector, and the students looked at it that way, and then they filled out the graphic organizer. So I could show it, multiple times, and that was easy to do. And then at the end of it, what you might want to do is use what the students have in the graphic organizer as a basis for class discussion. So for example, you might say, okay, what are some of the rights and privileges that you have or I would have the day I turned 18? Like probably a lot of students are going to say, well, I can vote, which is definitely true. In Indiana, you can legally sign a contract when you're 18. You're tried as an adult when you're 18. You can marry without parental consent at 18. So those are kind of some of the answers that students would come up with. And then below, issues for pushing for a lower voting age. Obviously, I grew up in a different era, so being drafted and going to fight in Vietnam would not be anything of importance to these kids, but it was for, kids growing up in the 1960s and in the 1970s like I did. So that might be an issue. It may be, I have to pay taxes too if I'm 16, or the coronavirus might infect me as much as being 16 as much as it does my teacher who's 65 or whatever. As far as rights and privileges for being 16, probably for my kids, the big one there is going to be driver's license. So that might be a big thing. I'm not quite sure what else in Indiana would be a big privilege that they would get at that age legally. Then at the end of the activity, there is a final analysis activity. And so what students do in this is they use the graphic organizer, the class discussion, the reflection questions, whatever they have, they use all that. And then what they do is they come up with a list of arguments about whether or not 16-year-olds, for example, in this instance, should have the right to vote. They provide explanations for, why they believe that those arguments are good or whether they're not good. And then what they do is they write an op-ed article about their thoughts on the proposition. I guarantee you that probably if I had 30 students in a class, I would get 30 essays, and every one of them would say, well, 16-year-olds should be granted the right to vote. And the reason why is because they are, 16 years old. I don't know, I guess, I could take the other side of that and be devil's advocate, and I could say, well, now wait a minute, what do you know about the issues? What do you believe about what the candidates stand for or whatever? And of course we could sit here and say, well, I know a fair number of 65-year-olds that don't know what the issues are. They're not voting for Biden or Trump because they believe what Biden or Trump believes in. They may vote because they like Trump's hair or or whatever it is. But it's, they may not be as well versed on the issues as they thought that they should be. One more time, I will remind everybody, if you have questions or comments, if you would like to type them in the chat box, Jessica can look at those. If there's anything she thinks that I need to be aware of at this point, if I'm going too fast, please let me know. But I've got a couple other resources I'd like to show you this evening. So, please feel free to let me know if there's anything that you would like me to respond to or touch on a second time or whatever. Okay, a newer lesson that I was not aware of until recently deals with the United States Postal System. And I wish I had had this one because when I was still in the classroom, because one of my students in my current events class, her dad is my mailman. So it would have been interesting to see her take on this. But as you all probably remember, that was the big issue, and I guess in some ways it still is, about defunding of the Postal Service, like whether or not the Postal Service was capable of delivering ballots, picking up ballots, returning ballots to the county government or whoever the election board would be so they could be counted in enough time. In Indiana, we can vote by mail if we have a valid reason. Believe it or not, coronavirus is not a valid reason. So if I said I wanted a mail-in ballot, and I said the reason why is because I'm scared to vote because I'm afraid I'll catch COVID-19, that would not allow them to give me a ballot. Being 65 does. So go figure. But anyway, it is an interesting thing. And I became a little bit concerned because all of a sudden, after this kind of became a big deal in the news, my mail started being delivered later and later and later. At one point, it was like after 5 o'clock before I got my mail. And I thought, well, maybe they are having trouble with all this. So I will vote early, but I will not vote by mail. I'll go vote at the courthouse. So in this instance, just like in the first activity I showed you this evening, it's got a pretty interactive screen here. It's got a nice colorful graphic that you can look at, which hopefully will get student interest. There is an introduction to the lesson where students will say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. It might mean as much for you as it does for the kids. We were supposed to put in a visible place in our classrooms every day what our objectives were for each period, each class. And if we did not do that, then if the principal came in to evaluate us, he would knock us on our evaluation because we did not have that. And so this might be a good opportunity for you just to say, oh, I'll just copy this down, principal will be happy, and I'll get a good evaluation. And just like the other activities, there's a ribbon menu where you can go from step to step to step in this. And again, I know I sound like a broken record. There's a teacher's guide. So that's going to be something that, might be very helpful for any number of reasons. So with this activity, if I can move to the next slide, again, just like with the others, there's a essay introduction. There's an essay that the kids read, and then they answer these questions. And again, they are DOK 1s in this instance, but there are also other DOK questions. I just couldn't fit them on the slide. So students, hopefully, my students probably would have no clue because it had been a long time since they covered the spoil system for a while. But maybe they might say, oh, I know what that means. That means to the victor belongs the spoils, that a president is going to appoint people to government jobs who supported him in the election or whatever. And there's a question about the postal system, and certainly we know people, I know we do, who rely on the Postal Service for any number of things, whether it's like they get their medication by mail, or they get pension checks by mail, or whatever it is. So it used to be for years, like during vacation times and during summer, we would be paid by mail because we weren't in the classroom to pick up our paychecks. So this was in an era before we had direct deposit and all that sort of thing. So I'd sit there anxiously waiting by the mailbox to get my paycheck so I could go pay my bills. Okay, so as I mentioned, each current events activity ends with some kind of task. And in this instance, there are multiple tasks that the students complete with this. So in this instance, they are looking at potential problems that face their state for planning for Election Day. So the number of COVID-19 cases in that state, whether they're increasing or decreasing, concern about mail-in voting, problems facing the postal system getting ballots to election offices in time. So what I would tell my students in Indiana is the law is that ballots can be mailed at any time, but they must be received by Election Day in order to count. So if it's November 1st, let's say, which would be a Sunday, but if it was November 1st and I hadn't mailed my ballot in, there could be a very good possibility that the election office wouldn't get my ballot in time and my vote wouldn't count. So the tasks involved would involve independent research or group research. And again, just like some of the other things that we talked about, there's critical thinking activities, there's summarization of different topics, there's writing, and even public speaking. So depending on what your comfort level is with your students, you could do any or all of those activities, and they would be highly effective. Okay. So I've done 3 current event activities. Let's move on to another set of activities that I did not have an opportunity to use very often with my students, mainly just because of COVID. But I did another series that was very similar to it, and these are mapping the news activities, which are related very closely to mapping U.S. history activities, which I used a lot. So again, there's a sample screen of what the activities look like. The activity that I'm going to discuss with you is not available at this point in time. It will be available later in October. Jessica might be able to help me with this at the end of the session, but I believe that everybody here will get a link to that activity, or it will be available at that point. I don't know the exact date for it, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. Each one of these activities are easily adapted for middle school or high school, and they last approximately 90 minutes. So you should count, if you're going to do this in a regular classroom setting, and you are, like we were like a 50-minute class period, that it's going to take you pretty close to 2 class periods. You know how it is. I mean, I'm probably not telling you something you don't already know, but like you've got to take a few minutes at the beginning of the hour to take attendance, and then invariably they'll come on the PA with some announcement, and then at the end, kids are saying, well, I've only got 5 more minutes in the period. I'm ready to stop, and I'm ready to sit and talk to my friends or whatever. So if it takes 90 minutes, you really don't have 90 minutes of class time in one section or 2 sections. You only have about 80 or so. So let's take a minute and look at an example activity. And one I picked is another one that's very much in the news lately, and that dealt with the George Floyd case. So I have not actually seen the activity itself for, the presidential election. However, it will look very similar to that. So as we've mentioned before, there's a ribbon menu where you can look at different things. There's also a teacher's guide. Over on this side, there is a set of map activities, and you can see it in a small green box right here. So what the students would do, they would read this. It says, before George Floyd's death, activists had long called for police accountability. It just kind of gives you an introduction. And as you can tell in the key here, what they've done is they've located different acts of police violence, if you want to use that term. George Floyd is here, Michael Brown is here, Breonna Taylor, and then some of the other ones too. So what they do is they read each box and they click next to go to the next one, and then what it does is it tells them to draw an arrow or put a black dot or, you know, whatever it's asking them to do. So these are, you know, in logical steps, and then at the end of the activity, there's a submit button that will allow them to submit the activity for, you know, the teacher to evaluate it. Okay, the activity that I'm going to discuss with you a little bit, I'm going to do this primarily with text, is called Mapping the Presidential Election. So this one would be, you know, really, really pertinent for this particular point in time. Certainly, you know, you've watched enough of the news, whether you're watching Fox or MSNBC or network or whatever you're doing, to know what the polls are showing, you know, as far as, you know, how is Biden doing in a state like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, or how is Trump doing in a state like Indiana or Florida or whatever. This activity was written by Greg Timmons. Probably if you have had much experience with Active Classroom, you may have seen Greg's work before. He did a couple of books of activities for, it's called Government Activators, for both the high school level and the middle school level. Greg has written several learning activities dealing with volunteerism in communities and all that. I've worked with Greg for a number of years on PBS lessons for different Ken Burns films, so I know if Greg puts something out there, it's done very well, and it'd be very effective for you. So this activity will be available later in October. So some of the things that students will be doing in this activity, they will be determining the difference between, you know, red states, blue states, and purple states, as well as swing states. These kids hear about these terms all the time, but do they really know what those terms mean? So I can tell you, I live in a red state. I can guarantee you 28 days out from the election, Donald Trump will win Indiana, because Republicans do very well here. On the other hand, I'm right next door to Illinois. Illinois is definitely a blue state, primarily because of Chicago. So Trump will win Indiana, but my bet is Biden will probably win in Illinois, unless something dramatic happens in the next 28 days. And I think you would all agree with me that there's always the possibility that something dramatic is going to happen in this campaign. Another thing that students don't really have much of a knowledge of, but they hear quite a bit, is the Electoral College. What exactly is it? What role does the Electoral College have in determining the winner or loser of, you know, the presidential election? And certainly, you know, we know in 2 elections in our lifetime, there have been candidates who have lost the popular vote, and that's George W. Bush and Donald Trump, but they've won the election because they won the Electoral College. So the activity, also asks students to create maps that track current polling trends. In other words, you know, like, is Trump leading in Florida? If he's leading in Florida, how much is he leading in Florida by? Is that amount higher than what it was a month ago? Is it lower than what it was a month ago? Does he still have the lead in Florida or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, or you know, and again, they can follow along with that and track as the campaign goes along. And then at the end of it, what they do is they track the candidate's progress, and they predict a winner who do they think will win the election? And of course, the really interesting thing about this election is I think we all are in agreement. I don't believe we are going to know by November 4th who actually won this election. I want to end up with, excuse me, some other resources that you might be able to use or want to use as far as things to teach about the presidential election. I mentioned government activators before. There is a really good one on political parties, campaigns, and election that might be really helpful to you, that you might want to use. Okay, if you have lower ability students, there is a set of activities called Power Basics, the federal government, presidential elections. So you could do this in a number of ways. If you taught a high interest, low ability class, you could use the activities for all of your students. If you had students who were, say, low reading ability or had learning disabilities of some sort, you could use the activities with them in, as a substitute for something for mapping the news. Or you could actually use them as a supplement for something else that you're doing. PowerPoint presentation in U.S. government. I use the PowerPoint presentations in U.S. government as my foundation for my government classes. So we did not use textbooks for about the last 12 or 15 years that I taught school. So what I did was I used Active Classroom. Okay, there's also some of We the People activities. Level 1 would be more grade school or middle school. How does the Constitution protect the right to vote? And another one, which is level 2, which would be more like a civics class. Maybe in Indiana it would be like grade 10. You could probably use it though for grade 12, which is when we teach government. How's the right to vote expanded since the Constitution was adopted? There are also various Interact presidential election simulations. So like, for example, if you were teaching a U.S. history class and you wanted to show a historical election in context with 2020, there's one, for example, on the election of 1800, which was a contested election that was thrown into the House of Representatives. So if by chance this election gets thrown into the House, you could do that also. And then there are also some videos, Framework for Democracy. Most of those videos last 5 minutes or so, give or take a little bit. And then they usually have 2 questions. One question is, what's the main idea of this video? And then the next question is for them to come up with a couple of supporting things that support that. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. So Jessica, I don't know if you want to unmute everyone or just let them answer questions in the chat area while I cough here. But if anybody has any specific questions you would like to ask about any of these activities or about anything else related to Active Classroom and how you might use it to teach about voting in the electoral process, I'll be happy to answer those.